3 houses burned down. Why? Because someone told me I couldn't use the lake that came with my deed. Sounds wild? Welcome to Pine Meadow, where HOA rules flip faster than reality TV alliances, and your neighbor might fine you for owning a blue garden hose. I moved here for peace and research. I got threats, mystery fines, and a president who ran things like a suburban dictatorship. No, I didn't light the match, but I did watch the whole thing unfold drone in hand. Want to know how it all spiraled from lake water to fire trucks? You'll want every messy detail. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done? My name is Ben Foster, and I moved to Pine Meadow in March after spending 5 years in Oregon documenting ecological changes for my books on environmental science. The house I bought was perfect, a modest 2-bedroom place right on Pine Lake, where I could continue my research on freshwater ecosystems using my drone equipment. The realtor had been very clear about the lake access rights that came with properties in Section B, and I had specifically chosen this location because my work required regular water quality testing and aerial surveys. That first month was everything I'd hoped for. The lake was pristine, the wildlife abundant, and the neighbors seemed friendly enough during our brief encounters at the mailbox or community bulletin board. Everything changed on that Friday afternoon when I was setting up my drone near the water's edge, preparing to collect data on algae distribution patterns. The late afternoon sun was perfect for underwater photography, and I just launched my equipment when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to see a woman approaching, probably late 20s, wearing faded fabric pants, an oversized hoodie that had seen better days, and flip-flops that slapped against the ground with each step. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she had the kind of expression that immediately told me this wasn't going to be a friendly neighborhood chat. She looked nothing like what I'd expect from an HOA president, but that's exactly what she was about to tell me she was. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative despite her casual appearance. "You're trespassing on a restricted area." I blinked, confused, looking around at the clearly public lake access point where I'd been coming for weeks without any issues. "I'm sorry, what?" I replied, genuinely puzzled. "I'm Ben Foster. I live at 23 Pine Circle. I was just doing some water quality testing." She crossed her arms and stepped closer, invading my personal space in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. "I'm Melanie Holbrook, president of the Pine Meadow Homeowners Association, and you're in violation of community regulations. This area is off limits to residents without proper permits." I felt my confusion deepen as I gestured toward the lake. "But I have lake access rights with my property deed. I've been coming here for weeks." Before Melanie could respond, an elderly woman walking a small terrier approached from the path behind us. She slowed down when she saw our interaction, and I caught her eye. "She's at it again," the woman whispered as she passed, loud enough for both of us to hear. Melanie's face flushed red, and she whipped around to glare at the older woman. "Mind your own business, Dorothy," she snapped. The woman, apparently named Dorothy, just shook her head and continued walking, but not before giving me a look that clearly said, "You're not the first one." This brief exchange told me everything I needed to know about the neighborhood dynamics, and none of it was good. Melanie turned back to me with renewed aggression, her voice rising slightly. "I don't care what your deed says. The HOA has authority to modify access rules for safety and community standards. You're operating unauthorized equipment in a sensitive environmental area, and I'm issuing you a $500 fine for violation of community regulations. If I catch you down here again, without proper authorization, the fine will double." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of me, my drone, and my equipment, making a big show of documenting everything. The whole situation felt surreal, like I'd accidentally wandered into some bizarre power trip disguised as neighborhood governance. I tried to keep my voice calm and reasonable, though my heart was starting to race. "Look, Melanie, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm an environmental scientist, and I specifically bought this property because of the lake access rights. I'm not doing anything harmful, just collecting scientific data on water quality and ecosystem health." She smirked, and there was something genuinely unpleasant about the expression. "Science or not, you don't have permission to be here. The HOA board voted on new regulations last month restricting lake access during certain hours and activities. Your little flying machine is a noise disturbance and potential safety hazard." I knew she was lying. I'd received no notice of any board meetings or new regulations, and I'd been checking the community bulletin board regularly. When Melanie walked away, Dorothy stepped over to me and spoke quietly. "You're not the first one, honey. Last year there was a family." But she stopped when she saw Melanie looking back in our direction. I had no idea that this was just the beginning of a war that Melanie had been preparing for a long time. What I also didn't know was that Dorothy Martinez had been fighting this same battle for over a year, and she was about to become my most valuable ally in exposing the truth about what was really happening in Pine Meadow. As I packed up my equipment that evening, watching Melanie's silhouette in her window across the lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just painted a target on my back. The next morning brought the first real surprise in what would become a very strange few weeks. Tucked into my mailbox between the usual junk mail and utility bills was a plain white envelope with no return address, just my name written in careful block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message that made my coffee suddenly taste bitter. Check deed, page 9. She's lying. Dash a friend. I stared at the note for a long moment, wondering who in Pine Meadow was brave enough to help but too scared to sign their name. The fact that someone felt the need to remain anonymous told me more about the neighborhood dynamics than any welcome wagon visit could have. I spent that entire evening going through every document for my house purchase, spreading everything across my kitchen table like some kind of legal detective. The deed was thick and filled with the usual property law language that makes most people's eyes glaze over, but I was determined to understand every detail. When I finally reached page 9, the language was crystal clear, written in plain English that left no room for interpretation. All homeowners in Section B shall have unrestricted access to Pine Lake for recreational and research purposes, without additional fees or permit requirements. There it was, black and white, completely contradicting everything Melanie had told me the day before. Armed with this information, I decided to get a professional opinion before confronting Melanie again. Dorothy had mentioned that Hank Morgan's wife Julia was a lawyer, so I walked over to their house on Saturday morning. Hank answered the door, a stocky, friendly man in his early 40s with the kind of weathered hands that spoke of years of physical work. "You must be the new guy with the drone," he said with a warm smile. "Julia's been wanting to meet you. She's got a thing for environmental law." Julia turned out to be exactly the kind of sharp, no-nonsense attorney you'd want on your side in a property dispute. After reviewing my deed and the original HOA bylaws, she was unequivocal. "You have absolute legal right to lake access. Any attempt to restrict that access without following proper legal procedures for deed modification would be invalid." Feeling confident with legal backing, I decided to confront Melanie directly on Sunday afternoon. I found her in her front yard, wearing the same type of casual, slightly shabby clothes I'd seen her in before. This time a pair of old yoga pants and a stained sweatshirt. She was half-heartedly pulling weeds from a flower bed that looked like it hadn't seen proper care in months. When she saw me approaching with my folder of documents, her expression immediately shifted from bored indifference to hostile alertness. "What do you want?" she asked, not bothering to stand up or even look directly at me. I kept my voice steady and professional. "I wanted to show you the deed language about lake access. I think there's been a misunderstanding about my rights as a property owner." Melanie stood up slowly, brushing dirt off her hands with deliberate movements that seemed designed to show how little she cared about whatever I had to say. "I already told you, those are old rules that don't apply anymore. The HOA has the authority to modify access regulations for safety and community standards." When I showed her the actual deed language, she barely glanced at it before dismissing it with a wave of her hand. "That's outdated. We passed new regulations last month that supersede those old provisions. The community voted to restrict lake access during certain hours and for certain activities. I knew she was lying because I'd been checking the community bulletin board regularly and had received no notice of any meetings or votes." The violation notices started arriving the next day, and they came with the persistence of a summer thunderstorm. Monday brought a citation for improper lawn height. Apparently my grass was 2 inches taller than community standards allowed. Tuesday was unauthorized outdoor equipment storage because my lawnmower was visible in my open garage. Wednesday brought noise disturbance violation for allegedly running my drone after quiet hours, which was impossible since I hadn't flown it since Friday. Each notice was professionally formatted on official HOA letterhead, complete with fine amounts and deadlines for compliance. The fines started at $50 but increased incrementally, and each notice threatened additional penalties for non-compliance. By Friday of that week, I had accumulated 12 separate violation notices for everything from inconsistent mailbox flag position to unapproved research activities in common areas. The creativity was almost impressive. Melanie was clearly putting significant effort into finding new ways to harass me daily. But what really caught my attention wasn't the absurdity of the violations themselves. It was the systematic nature of the harassment and the professional quality of the documentation. Someone was putting serious time and energy into making my life miserable, and I was starting to suspect this wasn't Melanie's first rodeo. That weekend, I ran into Dorothy Martinez while walking around the neighborhood, trying to clear my head and figure out my next move. She was tending to a beautiful garden in her front yard, and when she saw me, she beckoned me over with the conspiratorial air of someone who had important secrets to share. "You're getting the full treatment, aren't you?" she said, nodding toward the stack of violation notices I was carrying. "Last year, they did the same thing to the Peterson family. Nice people, had 2 kids, bought their house specifically for the lake access. Melanie made their lives so miserable, they ended up selling and moving away." Dorothy's story explained a lot about the neighborhood dynamics and why someone had felt compelled to send me that anonymous note. When I counted 12 violation notices in 1 week, ranging from truly petty complaints to completely fabricated infractions, I realized Melanie wasn't just trying to scare me. She was systematically harassing me with the kind of organized campaign that suggested experience and planning. But she didn't know that I survey terrain for a living, which means I'm very good at identifying patterns and mapping out systematic approaches to complex problems. The pattern I was about to discover would shock the entire community and expose a level of corruption that went far beyond simple power tripping. What I didn't yet realize was that my investigation skills were about to uncover evidence of financial fraud that would ultimately bring down not just Melanie, but the entire corrupt system she'd built around herself. My investigation into Pine Meadows HOA records started with a simple public records request at the county courthouse, but what I discovered was far more disturbing than I'd expected. The financial documents showed a pattern of special assessment fees collected over the past 3 years, with vague descriptions like community enhancement projects and emergency maintenance reserves. The problem was that none of these projects seemed to exist, and the money appeared to be flowing into accounts that weren't clearly designated as HOA funds. The deeper I dug, the more obvious it became that Melanie was running some kind of elaborate financial shell game with community money. What I found in those dusty file cabinets would eventually bring down her entire operation. But first, I had to survive what she was planning for me. While I was playing detective with public records, I got an unexpected ally in Tyler Chen, a 28-year-old marketing professional who lived 3 houses down from me. Tyler had moved to Pine Meadows 6 months earlier and had immediately clashed with Melanie over his vegetable garden, which she claimed violated aesthetic community standards. When he heard about my harassment campaign, he offered to help in a way that was perfectly suited to his generation: social media documentation. "Dude, you need to get this stuff on camera," he told me, pulling out his phone. "Nobody's going to believe how crazy this woman is unless they see it themselves. Trust me, I do this for a living." Tyler's suggestion would prove to be more important than either of us realized at the time, because what we captured that night would eventually be seen by thousands of people. The emergency HOA meeting was called for Thursday evening, with less than 48 hours' notice delivered via hastily printed flyers stuffed in mailboxes. The stated purpose was to address ongoing violations of community standards and implement enhanced security measures for common areas. Translation: Melanie wanted to officially ban me from the lake and make it look like a democratic decision by the community. Tyler had convinced me to let him live stream the meeting using his phone, positioning himself inconspicuously in the back of the Pine Meadow Community Center while I sat in the front row with my folder of evidence. What neither of us expected was that we were about to witness a complete meltdown of Melanie's carefully constructed facade. The community center felt like a powder keg as residents filed in for the 7 o'clock meeting. I recognized about half the faces from my brief time in the neighborhood, but what struck me was how divided people looked. Some nodding and smiling at me supportively, others avoiding eye contact entirely. Melanie arrived precisely at 7, now dressed in what I assumed was her official business outfit. A basic black blazer over a white blouse, both looking like they'd been purchased at a discount store. She was accompanied by Connie Wilkins, the HOA secretary, a severe-looking woman in her mid-40s who carried a thick folder and wore the expression of someone who enjoyed delivering bad news. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Melanie called the meeting to order with the kind of authoritative tone that suggested she'd been practicing in the mirror. "We're here tonight to address serious violations of community standards and implement necessary security measures to protect our neighborhood quality of life," she announced, looking directly at me with barely concealed hostility. "Over the past few weeks, we've documented multiple infractions, including unauthorized research activities, noise disturbances, and failure to maintain property standards." She gestured toward Connie, who began reading from her prepared list. "Improper lawn height, unauthorized equipment storage, violation of quiet hours." But before Connie could continue, something unexpected happened that changed the entire dynamic of the meeting. Dorothy Martinez, who had been sitting quietly in the third row, suddenly stood up and cut Connie off mid-sentence. "She's lying," Dorothy shouted, her voice shaking with emotion but carrying clearly through the room. "I've been keeping records for over a year, and half of those violations are completely made up. They did the same thing to my family and to the Petersons before they moved away." The room erupted in surprised murmurs as Dorothy continued, her voice growing stronger. "Ben isn't the first person she's targeted, and he won't be the last unless we stop this madness right now." Melanie's face went white, then flushed red as she lost control of her carefully orchestrated meeting. She started shouting over Dorothy, demanding that she sit down and stop disrupting official proceedings. But Dorothy wasn't finished. "You want to talk about violations?" Dorothy continued, pulling out a thick folder of her own. "Let's talk about the time you fined the Hendersons $50 for having their garbage can visible from the street on garbage day, or when you charged the Williams family $300 for planting native flowers in their own backyard." The room was buzzing now, with several residents turning to each other and whispering confirmations of Dorothy's accusation. Tyler, meanwhile, was capturing everything on his phone, and I could see the viewer count climbing as people shared the stream. Melanie was completely losing control, banging her gavel and threatening to call security, but the damage was done. Her authority had been publicly challenged, and the community was finally seeing her true colors. When the chaos finally died down and Melanie regained control of the meeting, the voting was as rigged as everything else about the evening. She had clearly stacked the room with supporters, including several residents I'd never seen before who claimed to be concerned community members. The final vote was 4-2 against my lake access privileges, with only Julia Harper and Frank Williams voting in my favor. But what the HOA board didn't realize was that Tyler's live stream had attracted over 200 viewers, including people from outside our community who were watching this obvious abuse of power unfold in real time. The comments were flowing, fast and furious. "This is insane. That woman is totally corrupt. Someone call the authorities. How is this legal in America?" As the meeting ended and people filed out, Ray Delaney, the HOA vice president, lingered near the parking lot. I could see him struggling with himself, starting to approach me several times before stopping and looking around nervously. Finally, when most people had left, he walked over to me with the cautious movements of someone approaching a dangerous animal. "Ben," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "things aren't what they seem here. Melanie's got leverage on some of us, dirt that could ruin lives if it got out." He paused, looking around nervously before continuing. "If you're really going to fight this, you need to be careful, but you also need to know that not everyone is against you. Some of us are just trapped." His words were cryptic, but the genuine fear in his eyes told me everything I needed to know about how Melanie maintained her iron grip on our community. Walking out of the community center with Tyler still live streaming, I could hear the comments from viewers around the world. "This is crazy. That woman is drunk with power. Someone needs to report this to the authorities." For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized that I wasn't alone in this fight. The entire internet had just witnessed Melanie's behavior, and she probably had no idea that the video was being saved and shared across multiple platforms. What she also didn't know was that her performance tonight had given me exactly the evidence I needed to take this fight to the next level. Local media loves stories about HOA abuse, and thanks to Tyler's live stream, I now had video proof of everything that had just happened. The war was far from over, but tonight had been a major victory for truth and transparency. Ray Delaney contacted me 3 days after the disastrous HOA meeting, asking if we could meet privately at the local coffee shop downtown. When he showed up, he looked like a man carrying the weight of the world, shoulders slumped, constantly checking over his shoulder, the kind of nervous energy that comes from keeping dangerous secrets for too long. "I need to tell you something about Melanie," he said quietly, stirring his coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "She's not just power-hungry, she's methodical about collecting dirt on people. She's got files on half the board members, myself included. Old business dealings, personal mistakes, things that could destroy people's lives if they got out." Ray's revelation explained a lot about the obviously rigged voting and the uncomfortable atmosphere during community meetings, but what he told me next made my blood run cold. "About 2 years ago, I made some poor investment decisions that technically violated my professional licensing requirements," Ray continued, his voice barely audible. "Nothing that hurt anyone, just paperwork violations, but enough to destroy my career if reported to the state board. Melanie found out somehow, I still don't know how, and she's been holding it over my head ever since. She's got a whole filing system of dirt on people, financial problems, marital issues, professional misconduct, you name it." He looked directly at me with desperate eyes. "I voted against you because I was scared, Ben. I'm ashamed of that, but I was terrified of what she'd do to my family if I crossed her. But if you're really going to fight her, you need to know that she's not just corrupt, she's dangerous. And she's got enough ammunition to destroy half this neighborhood if she wants to." Meanwhile, Hank Morgan had been sharing his own concerns about strange activities in our neighborhood, and his observations were starting to paint a disturbing picture. As a retired firefighter, he'd developed a professional eye for potential safety hazards, and something about Melanie's property was setting off every alarm bell in his head. "I've been noticing weird power fluctuations in this section of the neighborhood for months now," he told me during one of our evening conversations by the lake. "My lights dim randomly, especially at night, and my electric bill has been higher than normal even though I haven't changed my usage patterns. Plus, there's this constant humming sound coming from Melanie's garage area, like heavy industrial equipment running around the clock. In my professional opinion, whatever she's got going on over there is a serious fire hazard waiting to happen." Curiosity and a growing sense of urgency drove me to conduct some aerial reconnaissance of the neighborhood using my drone. I waited until dusk, when the failing light would make my equipment less visible, and launched my drone from the far side of the lake. What I discovered from above was absolutely shocking. Melanie's garage had multiple, unauthorized electrical connections running to it from different directions, including what appeared to be a direct tap into the main community electrical grid. The cables snaked through her yard like a spider web, some buried shallow enough to be visible from above, others running along fence lines and through neighboring property. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. Hidden behind her house, completely invisible from street level, were several modified shipping containers with heavy-duty electrical cables and what looked like industrial cooling equipment. As I was maneuvering my drone for a better angle, something happened that nearly made me crash the equipment. Melanie suddenly burst out of her back door, screaming and waving her arms at my drone. But instead of just yelling, she grabbed what looked like a baseball bat and started swinging it wildly at the air, as if she could somehow knock my drone out of the sky from ground level. Her reaction was so violent and over the top that it confirmed my suspicions. Whatever she was hiding in those containers was serious enough to make her completely lose control at the mere possibility of being observed. I quickly piloted the drone back to my location, but not before capturing clear footage of her manic behavior and the oneirotic electrical infrastructure that would prove crucial later. Word was spreading through the community about my conflict with Melanie, and more residents were starting to approach me with their own horror stories. But it was Dorothy Martinez who provided the most damning evidence when she invited me to her house for what she called show and tell. Instead of just recounting her experiences verbally, Dorothy had been systematically documenting everything for over a year. She led me to her dining room, where she had converted the entire space into what looked like a war room. Tables covered with photographs, violation notices, financial records, and even audio recordings of threatening phone calls. "I may be 67 years old, but I'm not naive," she said, her eyes blazing with determination. "When they started targeting my family, I decided to fight back the only way I knew how. With evidence." Dorothy pulled out a photograph that made my stomach drop. It showed Melanie's garage door partially open, revealing rows of electronic equipment with blinking lights and multiple power cables. "I took this 6 months ago when I was walking my dog," Dorothy explained. "I didn't know what I was looking at then, but I knew it didn't belong in a residential garage. That humming sound Hank mentioned, it's been going on for over 2 years, but it's gotten much louder recently. And look at this." She showed me a series of photographs documenting Melanie's increasingly erratic behavior, screaming at neighbors, destroying property, and in one particularly disturbing image, apparently following a resident's car to document their activities. "She's not just corrupt," Dorothy said grimly. "She's becoming unhinged, and I'm afraid of what she might do if she feels cornered." Melanie's response to the growing community unrest was to escalate her tactics in ways that shocked even her previous supporters. She hired a private security company to patrol the lake area, claiming it was necessary to prevent unauthorized activities and maintain community safety standards. The security guards were intimidating men in uniform who made a point of checking identification and questioning anyone who approached the water. But what really outraged the community was when one of the guards was caught on Tyler's phone camera roughly handling an elderly resident who was simply trying to feed the ducks. The video went viral locally, and suddenly Melanie's name was being mentioned on neighborhood watch groups throughout the county. The constant humming from Melanie's garage was becoming impossible to ignore, especially at night when other sounds died down. Several residents mentioned it independently, describing it as the kind of sound you'd expect from a data center or cryptocurrency mining operation. Hank was particularly concerned because his firefighter experience had taught him to recognize the warning signs of electrical fires. "Whatever she's running in there is drawing massive amounts of power," he told me one evening, as we stood in his backyard, listening to the mechanical drone that seemed to pulse with electrical rhythm. That kind of electrical load, especially with unauthorized connections, is a catastrophic fire risk. One power surge, one overheated cable, and this whole neighborhood could go up in flames. His words would prove to be prophetic in ways that none of us could have imagined. Standing in the darkness looking toward Melanie's house, watching the strange lights flickering through her garage windows and listening to that ominous humming sound, I realized that her desperate attempts to control lake access were just the tip of the iceberg. She wasn't just hiding corruption, she was hiding something that could endanger the entire community. The pieces were starting to come together, but I had no idea that Melanie's illegal operation was about to create consequences far beyond anything she'd planned for. What I also didn't know was that her increasing paranoia and desperation were about to push her into making the kind of catastrophic mistake that would expose everything and bring her entire criminal enterprise crashing down around her. By late June, I decided that the only way to fight Melanie's systematic abuse was to organize the community independently of the corrupt HOA structure she controlled. Tyler offered to host a meeting at his house, and we spent several days quietly reaching out to residents who had expressed frustration with the current situation. The response was overwhelming. 23 people showed up on a Wednesday evening, filling Tyler's living room and spilling out onto his back deck. The diversity of the group surprised me. Young families, retirees, professionals, blue-collar workers, all united by their shared frustration with Melanie's authoritarian tactics. The community meeting turned into a 3-hour session of people sharing their experiences with HOA abuse under Melanie's leadership. Story after story emerged of arbitrary fines, selective enforcement of vague rules, and intimidation tactics designed to silence anyone who questioned the board's decisions. Martha Rodriguez brought copies of violation notices she'd received for infractions that other residents were never cited for. Frank Williams had documentation showing that his requests for HOA financial records had been ignored for over 8 months. The pattern was clear and consistent. Melanie was running the HOA like a personal fiefdom, with rules that applied differently depending on whether she liked you or not. Dorothy Martinez became the star of the evening when she presented a thick folder of documents she'd been collecting for over a year. "I may be 67 years old, but I'm not stupid," she announced to the room. "I've been documenting every interaction, every violation notice, every suspicious decision this HOA has made since they started targeting my family." Her files included copies of altered meeting minutes, evidence of board meetings held without proper notice, and financial records that showed money being transferred to accounts with no clear connection to legitimate HOA business. The room fell silent as people realized the scope of corruption they were dealing with. Tyler's suggestion to create an online community group proved to be genius. Within 24 hours of our meeting, our private group had grown to over 50 members, including several residents who had been too intimidated to attend in person. People started sharing photos of ridiculous violation notices, documenting instances of selective rule enforcement, and coordinating their responses to HOA harassment. The digital paper trail we were creating would prove invaluable later, but more importantly, the group gave people a sense of solidarity and shared purpose that Melanie's divide and conquer tactics had been designed to prevent. Melanie's response to our growing organization was swift and predictably overreaching. She filed a restraining order against me, claiming that my harassment and intimidation of HOA board members was creating a hostile environment in the community. The legal papers arrived on a Friday afternoon, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who seemed apologetic about the whole situation. The restraining order prohibited me from attending HOA meetings, approaching board members, or engaging in any activities that could be construed as interfering with legitimate HOA governance. It was a desperate move, but it was also expensive. Restraining orders require legal fees, court appearances, and sworn testimony. The restraining order backfired spectacularly in terms of community opinion. Residents who had been neutral or mildly supportive of Melanie were shocked by what they saw as a dramatic escalation of petty neighborhood politics. Julia Harper offered to represent me pro bono, arguing that the restraining order was a clear abuse of the legal system designed to silence legitimate criticism of public officials. More importantly, the legal proceedings were public record, which meant local media attention was inevitable. A story about HOA corruption and abuse of power was exactly the kind of human interest piece that local news stations love to cover. The community fundraising effort to help with my legal expenses raised over $2,000 in less than a week, with contributions ranging from $5 donations to a $200 check from Frank Williams. The fundraising wasn't just about money. It was a visible demonstration of community support that sent a clear message to Melanie about how isolated she'd become. Even some residents who had previously supported her started privately expressing doubts about her leadership and questioning whether she'd gone too far in her vendetta against me. Julia Harper's investigation into the restraining order revealed something crucial. The HOA had spent over $5,000 in legal fees over the past year, all for harassment campaigns against residents who had challenged board decisions. This was community money being used to silence community members, and it was arguably illegal misuse of HOA funds. When Julia filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office about misuse of community association funds, she opened up a whole new front in our battle against Melanie's corrupt leadership. Sitting in the courthouse that evening, with the restraining order paperwork in my hand and legal bills mounting, I almost gave up. Almost. The whole situation felt surreal, being legally prohibited from participating in my own community's governance because I dared to question obvious corruption and abuse of power. But when I drove home and saw Melanie's smirk through her window, something inside me snapped with crystal clarity. She had pushed me to the breaking point, and now she was about to learn why you should never corner someone who has nothing left to lose. What she didn't realize was that her desperate legal escalation had actually provided me with the perfect opportunity to expose everything I'd discovered about her illegal activities. My master plan came together during the first week of July, when I coordinated with both the EPA and the local fire department to conduct what they called a routine safety inspection of our neighborhood's electrical and environmental systems. Hank's concerns about electrical hazards had given me the perfect legitimate reason to request official inspections, and my documentation of unauthorized electrical connections provided probable cause for a more thorough investigation. I had no idea that this inspection would coincide with the most dramatic vindication I could have imagined. Tuesday evening, July 9th, was one of those hot, dry summer nights when the air feels thick with potential energy. I was sitting on my back deck reviewing legal documents for my restraining order hearing when I heard Hank shouting from across the lake. "Fire! Fire at the Holbrook place!" I looked up to see orange flames shooting from Melanie's garage area, rapidly spreading to the main house and threatening the two neighboring properties. The scene was surreal. What had started as a typical quiet evening was suddenly transformed into chaos, with sirens wailing and neighbors running toward the flames with garden hoses and buckets. Hank immediately took charge of the emergency response, his firefighter training kicking in automatically. He coordinated evacuation of the threatened houses, directed neighbors in containing the spread, and provided crucial information to the arriving fire department about the property layout and potential hazards. What he discovered during the firefighting efforts would change everything. The fire had started in Melanie's garage due to an electrical overload in what appeared to be an illegal, high-powered computing operation. The garage was filled with cryptocurrency mining equipment, dozens of specialized computers generating enormous amounts of heat and drawing massive electrical power from unauthorized connections. The environmental disaster became apparent as the fire spread to the area where Melanie had illegally modified the neighborhood's drainage systems. Her unauthorized water diversions had created a dry zone that acted like kindling, allowing the fire to spread rapidly toward the lake itself. Years of illegal landscaping modifications, designed to redirect water flow for her personal benefit, had created the perfect conditions for an ecological catastrophe. The irony was impossible to ignore. Melanie's desperate protection of her lake access had been covering up environmental crimes that ultimately threatened the very ecosystem she claimed to be preserving. As firefighters worked to contain the blaze, investigators discovered evidence that Melanie had been attempting to destroy documents in the fire. Partially burned financial records were scattered around her yard, along with melted computer hard drives and destroyed filing cabinets. But the digital age makes document destruction much more difficult than people realize. Cloud backups, email records, and electronic banking transactions had preserved most of the evidence of her financial crimes. The fire department's investigation would eventually reveal that the cryptocurrency mining operation had been stealing electricity from the community grid for over 2 years. The magnitude of Melanie's illegal activities became clear over the following days as investigators pieced together the evidence. The cryptocurrency mining operation explained the power fluctuations that Hank had noticed. Her equipment was drawing enormous amounts of electricity during peak hours, causing brownouts and increased utility costs for the entire neighborhood. The unauthorized electrical connections were not only stealing power, but creating serious fire hazards that violated multiple building codes and safety regulations. Her illegal water diversions had been designed to provide cooling for her mining equipment while creating private water features on her property. More shocking was the discovery that Melanie had been using HOA funds to finance her cryptocurrency operation. The special assessment fees and mysterious community improvement projects had actually been funding her illegal business venture. She'd been systematically embezzling money from neighbors while simultaneously harassing them with bogus violations and excessive fines. The estimated total of stolen funds exceeded $50,000 over 3 years, not including the cost of illegally consumed electricity and environmental damage. The community rallied together during the fire emergency in a way that revealed the true character of our neighborhood. Residents opened their homes to displaced families, organized food and clothing donations, and worked together to assess environmental damage to the lake. Even people who had previously supported Melanie were horrified by the revelation of her illegal activities and the environmental threats she'd created. The fire had literally and figuratively burned away the facade of legitimate governance that she'd been hiding behind. Watching the flames reflect on the surface of Pine Lake that night, I realized that justice doesn't always come in the form we expect. Melanie had spent years thinking she was untouchable, above the law, above consequences for her actions. But karma has a way of catching up with people, and sometimes it comes in the form of the very greed and corner-cutting that brought you power in the first place. The fire was nobody's fault but Melanie's, a direct result of her illegal electrical work and environmental violations. Mother Nature had delivered the justice that our corrupt HOA system had failed to provide. The investigation that followed the fire moved quickly. Once federal agencies got involved, the Environmental Protection Agency filed charges related to illegal water diversion and environmental damage. The IRS opened an investigation into unreported income from cryptocurrency mining and embezzlement of HOA funds. The state attorney general's office pursued charges for misuse of community association funds and fraud. Within 2 weeks, Melanie was facing federal charges that could result in years in prison and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines and restitution. The restraining order against me was immediately dismissed when the full scope of Melanie's illegal activities became clear. Julia Harper successfully argued that my harassment had actually been legitimate whistleblowing that exposed serious crimes affecting the entire community. The judge who had originally granted the restraining order publicly apologized for being manipulated by false information and praised the community's efforts to expose corruption. Local media coverage turned me from a troublemaker into a community hero who had risked personal harassment to protect his neighbors from ongoing victimization. Ray Delaney's confession about Melanie's blackmail operation opened the floodgates for other board members to come forward with their own stories of intimidation and coercion. Connie Wilkins, the HOA secretary, admitted to forging documents and falsifying meeting minutes under Melanie's direction. She provided investigators with detailed records of how the document forgery operation worked and helped prosecutors understand the full scope of the fraud. Her cooperation in exchange for reduced charges gave investigators the roadmap they needed to unravel years of systematic corruption. The emergency HOA election held in August was like a celebration of democracy after years of authoritarian rule. Tyler live-streamed the entire process, ensuring complete transparency in vote counting and candidate presentations. The new board was elected unanimously, with Julia Harper serving as interim president while new bylaws were drafted to prevent future abuse. One of the first acts of the new board was to refund all bogus fines and fees that had been collected under Melanie's administration, returning over $15,000 to community members who had been illegally penalized. Dorothy Martinez received not only a public apology but financial compensation for the harassment and stress she'd endured during Melanie's reign of terror. The new board officially recognized her persistence in documenting corruption and credited her record-keeping with providing crucial evidence for the prosecution. Her lake access privileges were fully restored, and she was honored as a community hero during the first legitimate HOA meeting we'd had in years. Watching Dorothy finally get the recognition she deserved was one of the most satisfying moments of the entire ordeal. The Environmental Restoration Project became a community-wide effort that brought neighbors together in ways that years of normal HOA meetings never could have. We organized monthly lake cleanup events, native plant restoration projects, and water quality monitoring programs. My original research on lake ecology became the foundation for a comprehensive environmental stewardship plan that turned Pine Meadow into a model community for sustainable living. The illegal water diversions were properly removed and replaced with rain gardens and natural drainage systems that actually improved the local ecosystem. Melanie's complete downfall was as dramatic as her rise to power had been gradual. Her house was destroyed in the fire, her legal troubles mounted daily, and her reputation in the community was utterly ruined. The cryptocurrency mining operation that she'd thought would make her rich instead left her facing massive debts, criminal penalties, and civil lawsuits from neighbors seeking compensation for stolen electricity and environmental damage. Last anyone heard, she was working at a call center in another state, still paying off legal fees and restitution that would follow her for years to come. The transformation of Pine Meadows HOA from a corrupt dictatorship into a transparent, democratic organization became a model for other communities struggling with similar problems. We implemented online voting systems, live-streamed all meetings, published detailed financial reports, and created citizen oversight committees to ensure accountability. Local newspapers wrote feature articles about our turnaround, and other neighborhoods started requesting advice on how to reform their own problematic HOAs. What had started as my personal fight for lake access had become a blueprint for community empowerment. Sitting by Pine Lake on a peaceful summer evening, with my drone buzzing overhead collecting water quality data and Tyler live streaming our weekly community update, I think about this incredible journey we've all been on. Melanie taught us that when communities come together and refuse to be bullied, justice finds a way to prevail. Sometimes standing up to bullies requires more courage than you think you have, but when you find that courage, you don't just save yourself, you save your entire community. And sometimes justice comes not from revenge, but from people simply refusing to accept injustice anymore. Oh, and about that lake access? Every weekend now, families picnic by the water, kids fish from the shore, and the ecosystem is thriving better than ever. Melanie would absolutely hate that,